talk which is called the convergence of the cults. Right, near where I live, this is what the first white people saw, particularly down low, mid-slope and low slope. They saw a woodland, grassland ecosystem.
In my experience, I've been around the Central West. I've seen only a handful of those environments. One's Woodstock Cemetery, where that's basically the photo. One is on the Talbragar system, where you have a mulch that thick on beautiful, full forbs, beautiful species. Had been grazed, locked up by a bachelor for 80 years, grown one beast per 10 hectares, and it was a dynamic system. I got asked to come in and sow native grasses into it, and I said, I don't understand this system. This is too beautiful. It had rare and endangered species that I had never seen before on it. So, and they're the messages that are going through it. That landscape was different. So we've changed it.
Yep. So, widely spaced trees, right? And if you believe that the first fellas that looked a little bit like me that rode through here, that were they property developers or were they scientists? They were more on the property developers end of things. And they talked about open areas, didn't they? Yep, they talked about open areas and how different that was to the swamps and forests of what we now call Western Sydney. Okay. So from they mainly would get a ferry before they would walk across that part of the landscape before. And then over time, with grazing, that landscape turns to that. So we still see the remnants of the spacing, don't we? Okay. We talked about that this morning. Everything seemed to work when that was happening. And what's changed? So, usually simple answers to most complicated problems, and they're usually wrong. Right. Cults are great, right? When they provide systems of knowledge which make complicated things seem approachable. Watch that show on SBS about all the survivors of Scientology. Okay. Cults provide individuals with actions that make positive differences pretty quickly, right? And they provide support systems to help individual people through change. And one of the most powerful, broad-scale NRM cults that Nico and I have witnessed in our professional lives has been the understanding of time-controlled grazing. Okay? It has had an amazing positive benefit on millions of hectares in Australia. Cults are not that great when they provide really simplistic systems of knowledge which claim to be universally applicable in every situation. Scientology will make your life better, and yours. I don't need to hear about your life, I've got the answer. Right? Cults are not great when they provide individuals with recipes and set actions and ways of thinking rather than principles and guidelines, okay? And if the people in the cult only speak to other people in the cult, then groupthink happens, etc. Okay? The nastiest cults I've been involved with are organics certified soil management cults. They're vicious to each other because if you're not in their tent, they all have some real gold in there, but they're so exclusive, and so they only talk to each other. Everyone else is an idiot. Right. So when we approach this incredibly exciting, scary journey of managing an ecosystem, the first time you look at it, it's hard, right? And sometimes you have to totally change your paradigms, change your viewpoint, and that's really hard. And then once you're in that cult, another one comes along that has something to teach you. The second one's even harder, right? When you go from the truth and the justice to another one, that's even harder. But once you've done two, in our experience, you want a new one about every 6 months because everyone's got something to add to this conversation. And we particularly saw it with the rise of some of the ways that people understood grazing management in the Central West, that when they were in here, they were evangelical, right? I have the answer for you. It changed my life. And some of those people are incredibly fun to be around, but sometimes quite dangerous in how they approach things because they think they have the answer to every question. Don't even need the question. Got the answer. Right, so the design rules not recipes, that we talked about were more perennial things, more diversity of things, happy soils, right? Healthy soils. How do farmers do that? Multitudes of ways is the answer. Multitudes of ways. Salt patch, right? Put some trees around it, work out where your plumbing's going, intercept that water before it gets to the salt. Starts to do that, right? Starts to look like that. Starts to be the best paddock on the farm. Okay? We've messed with the hydrology. Hundreds of litres of water that used to come out of the ground and bring salt with it is now being transpired by that tree. Thousands of litres of water that used to be transpired by that perennial pasture base is now not becoming a salt patch. Okay? Right? This farmer still grows areas on his farm of annual, shallow-rooted, short-season plants. But it's not all of his farm, and it's not in the hazardous bits. And he balances that with block plantings of trees to stop recharge. So even in a couple of 100 metres on that farm, we see a farmer respond to an understanding of his plumbing and go, stop the water going in over there, use it in my agricultural system here, mix up my agricultural system so it doesn't behave all the same all the time, and have a safety valve at the bottom of the hill. Right? More perennial things. The sheep love the salt paddock, right? And it's been really interesting working with some Wiradjuri people around Wellington and Cowra. Some of these long-term saline areas, their knowledge is very important for old people and pregnant people because they had special plants growing in them with special mineral compounds, right? We just took away the plants and it looked yucky. They had the right plants there and it was an asset. And if there's one thing you learn about going to this farm at Ian Cooley's place, he looks at salty water coming out of the ground as a potential asset. How did I miss this in my farming system? How did I miss this in the worst drought, 120 years? Right? Bitter pill to swallow. So now what we see in areas of his farm is mixtures of things going on, managed by animals to promote maximum water use in the root zone. Create a bigger door so that more water can go into the soil. Create a bigger room with the way your plants are behaving to store more water in the root zone. Right? If the plants are this high when it gets rain, they have a chance to use some water. If they're this high, they haven't got a chance to use the water. Right?
Can I just ask, something that's always fascinated me, coming from a non-farming background, not understanding a lot of that stuff, is that there is a practice that seems to be around to kill off all living things to preserve water in the soil.
Yep.
How does that affect this, problem of salinity and having water rising and not having that transpiration? Is it a useful practice or is it kind of hindering in other?
Okay. Many cropping systems are on the edge of having the right amount of moisture available at the right time to grow the crop. If you're a farmer and you don't have the right amount of water to grow the plant at the right time, you get a very visible, financially painful kick in the bum. Okay? So farmers respond to that risk by trying to create conditions where they've got the maximum ability to store water in the soil profile by removing competition. It does also maximise the risk of there being too much water in the soil profile and creating either deep drainage or runoff. But we don't get the immediate kick in the pants for that. That's something that builds up over time. And it may soak in on my farm and come out on Nico's farm. No problem. Best thing ever. Yep. So it's about that cause and effect separated by distance and time. And many environmental issues that we're really grappling with are that. Very much that, aren't they? Yeah. Erosion's the other one. Okay, different scenario. Richard Langley. former head of the Central West Conservation Farming Association. So people who are very interested in growing lots of particularly grain crops, and they love toys. He has salt patches on his farm, and he's turned them into fodder factories. So he surrounds them with salt-tolerant trees. This distance from here to here is based on his haymaking equipment. And he just grows, in this case, a salt-tolerant pasture mix of tall wheatgrass, some types of philera and fescue, and some clovers. Grows that in there. Sheep never go in there. He just cuts the hay and takes it somewhere else. Okay? He's maximising water use with diesel and steel. Okay? Yep. Get that pumping for you. Stop the salt concentrating at the surface. Get the plants to live with the lower level of background groundwater salinity rather than the nasty concentrated bit at the top. Okay? He also, he's a precision farmer. So there's tricky things that go beep in there, and so he will sow a crop and he will do soil moisture measurements, so far be it from trying to load his soil profile up with water. He tries to have something growing all the time because he's very concerned about his soil biology. So he'll grow a crop, and if he thinks that there's soil water left over at that crop and he's got a likelihood of rain in the next, so he might grow a winter crop, he will then dial into his machine, move this implement 8 centimetres to the left and sow another crop down there. Okay? Because he's getting annual plants to behave like perennial plants. Okay? In his system. So it's a bit about the diesel and steel, but it's a lot about the system. Right? Okay. He also sprays a lot of soil bugs around. You can notice that his crop residues are all lying down. He either flattens them with sheep or with machines, and he sprays composting bugs on there that turn it into dirt really quickly. And he's really fundamentally changed the top 20 centimetres of his soil in the last 15 years or so, turning it more into an organic layer.
Did you say composting bugs?
Yeah. So there's a whole agricultural field called bioag, where you buy bugs in bottles, you brew them up and you spray them out. Same as you buy stuff to accelerate your home compost. That's a different cult. I'm in that one too. Right, some people love big woody things. There's a guy near Young, big salt area down there. Got the guy who knew a lot about salt-tolerant trees at the time, and they put the most salt-tolerant trees they could find that would grow in that area in there, right? They're all now sailing away using hundreds of litres per tree per day in the summertime, right? Turn the water balance around. He also knew he had a bit of through flow, a bit of water coming down the hill at a shallow depth. So he got involved with a joint venture forestry enterprise and put in belts of pine trees coming down his hill. Their aim is always to be harvested at some point. Sometimes the easiest win you can have is at the less tricky sites. So don't go to the nastiest salt patch that the last 3 owners have all tried and cried with. Go to one that's easy to start with, have a bit of a win. And you can do just pretty simple things like changing the hydrology with just some reasonably local, reasonably waterlogging tolerant, salt tolerant trees and get them in there and protect that area, right? That can have a big impact. This is, I suppose, this is not too far from here. It's farmers looking at this new field of cereal intercropping. So there's a perennial summer-based pasture under this wheat crop. People heard of this? Particularly pioneered by some local legends like Col Size over at Gulgong. This is down near Canowindra. So again, it's about these farmers who want to grow some wheat, want to grow an annual thing. Know there's some negative things about how we used to grow wheat. Let's leave the summer base in there and get the crop in over the top, right? Now the penalty is that some years you have a yield reduction, right, because the crop gets out-competed for water. But every year, the day that crop is harvested, you have a pretty good pasture underneath.
Do you select for that special crops that have longer stems? sense? Because a lot of people sort of say, well, you have to get rid of all the competition so that then when you harvest you don't get spoiled stuff. Is that because if you've got ryegrass growing in amongst
A bloke I used to play footy with is a seed sorter now. It costs single figures per tonne to do if it's really important to you.
So that argument is really no longer.
It's similar to wanting to have the biggest cow at the show. You know, it's something that some people really hang their hat on, but agriculturally, when it comes to your bottom line, I think people are fishing for reasons why they don't want to do it, if that's the only reason they don't want to do it. Okay, we see this thing around here, spiny rust, Juncus acutus, and I think the ones around here get about this big, right? Now, if you go to Young and Cootamundra and Harden, they get higher than a ute, okay, right? We have to get D9s in to push them out. Like your part of the world, they're also a salt indicator species, and they are slowly spreading, right? Really nasty, particularly if you've got cows, because they get them in the eye. That's a salt-tolerant forestry enterprise that's on a wheat farm near Harden. Okay. Yeah, it is. It's not endemic to the area because 200 years ago this wouldn't have been a waterlogged zone. Okay. So we have to think about what are the different options, what's the plumbing, what goes in the right spot. Okay. So that's just showing option A being farmer, boundary fence, and a whole area of that spiny rush as being option B. We talked about this morning. Saltbush, right? A true halophyte. Actually, most plants that we plant are just better or worser at holding salt out of their system, right? We call that salt tolerance, how you can cope with salt by keeping it out of your system. True halophytes, like salt bushes, absorb it into their system, right? Which can be good. This was, Allan and I went there in the late 1990s. It was about, Andrew Harris's, about 15 hectares of, it looked like this. It was just totally bare, about third seawater within 2 metres of the surface. Put the salt bush in. What's the salt bush done? One, it's absorbed a little bit of salt out of the topsoil, right? It's grown. It grows on the salty groundwater. It creates this microclimate which slows down evaporation, right? So we don't get as much salt concentrating at the surface, which starts to allow lots of annual grasses to come back into the system, right? So when we plant salt bush, it's about how we create that system. It's not that it's the silver bullet, right? I still have a line in my head about where I think saltbush is this type of saltbush, old man saltbush, is a real option. Me and Allan differ on this line a lot. I think it's about 150 kilometres that way. Nico thinks it's much closer, right? This is out at Quandialla near West Wylam.
What do you mean by you think it should be?
Saltbush struggles with waterlogging and with alkaline subsoils.
We've got two very healthy ones.
Yeah, and so what we find in tablelands environments, people have lots of success with it until they graze it, and then it falls over. And not on all sites, but the opposite of where old man saltbush grows. So if I go to Narromine and I see a natural stand of old man saltbush, it'll be on a slight rise, it'll be on a freely drained soil, it gets waterlogged with fresh water for about 6 weeks, every 18 months, and it won't get a frost, right? And I think putting them in low-lying salt patches at Ralston and Candos is pretty much the opposite of that, so much higher risk of things not working. But if you put them in a tree line and don't have animals at them all the time, they'll grow this big. They'll be great.
Those aren't waterlogged, but they survive through the -7.
And they're in clayey soil.
Clay soils, yeah, great. This is a bloke near Young, again, just mixing it up on his farm, mixing it up. Managing pastures. That particular photo is of a management area zone where we said it'd be good to try and intercept some water, right? And that's what that looks like in a farming system. If you're going to plant some trees, put them in that spot where they're going to do the most point. We've come a long way from thinking salt is bad, trees are good. every tree is going to fix salt, right? Some can be in the right spot, some can dry up fresh water and make it worse, some can do absolutely nothing. This is an example of him targeting where that water's actually moving before it gets to the salt patch. Okay? Yep.
So how does that work, sorry?
In this landscape, there's a high proportion of the problem water moving within about 1.5 metres of the surface down that slope. Right? So if we target that zone away from the saline area, put some high water using trees, they're going to grab that water before it gets to the high salt store soil. Yep. We call that interception tree planting. Most rooms we go into, we have to tell people it's going to be suitable on about 1 in 20 farms, right? Because you need that high proportion of lateral flow for it to work. In landscapes where you've got lots of lateral flow, we can probably bump that number up a fair bit. Right?
Trees also sort of drag the water table up a bit, up the hill a bit, so to speak, so that it drops in the lower area.
Oh yeah. They'll be using water there, which will create a cone of depression behind it. Yeah, if the movement is downhill. If the movement's just coming up, which it is in many places, water goes in over there and comes up here, then they'll dry themselves out and not much have an influence either side.
So don't you have to irrigate that area? Like
Subsurface irrigation.
It's there. The reason that salt patch is there is...
still coming through.
Yeah.
There's too much water.
Yeah.
If you reduce the water, you
Get rid of the concentration.
I know, but then you want to grow plants.
Yeah. And that'll slowly grow in. The point is you think about what's causing that problem. Go and turn the cause off. Then you can deal with an easier situation where you are. Yep. Nope. Okay. Right. So here. So
I'm confused about the water. So the water's coming down there and it's bringing with it salt.
The water, if we dug a hole here and saw the water and measured the water, it'd be fresh.
Right.
It's good water up there.
Okay.
There's a big salt store sitting under this dirt.
Store is there.
So we put the water pressure into that salt store, up she comes.
Where's that salt come from?
Where's that? Cyclic.
So it's just under the ground.
Yeah. So it's...
But as long as the water were to travel, the fresh water is going to travel along the top, it'll be okay.
No. We're going to turn off the water pressure. Right? So we're going to turn this back into a drained flow line by not having extra water.
Stuff in there, you still want water on it.
There will be.
It's not like it's going
Yeah,
dry.
the problem is there's too much
Umbrella
water.
over it.
Be less saline.
The problem is there's too
No,
much
but my
water.
problem, my thing, okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. You're not alone, George. It's all
Okay.
good. Just go.
Can I go back? The design rules are more perennial things, more diversity of things, healthier soils. That farmer's chosen to do that in that way, right? What they're relying on is making a big change at a specific point, right? Whatever we do, if we say the answer is a big change at a specific point, high percentage for fuck up, right? High, because we're throwing the Hail Mary pass to do that one thing, right?
So if we want to apply this to our farm, we have to get it today.
No. What you have to get is that there are some actions which require a lot of skill to get in the right spot. Yeah. If you don't understand your plumbing.
We'll organise another workshop in what, 1 month's time? We're already for another one in 4 weeks.
On site.
On site, yeah. Whose house first?
All we need to do is get up.
East Bay. Yep. Find your diagram. Work out which bit you're on.
Guarantee you'll still need help after that.
Yep. We do go into land care groups where we say, okay, granite people over there, shale people over there, start the meeting. Yeah. We do that. Okay. The holistic grazing cult, time control grazing, cell grazing. It's used by lots of words. What does it do? It partitions animals in the landscape in a way which maximises evapotranspiration. Okay? It uses animal behaviour to encourage ground cover with mulch, to promote biological cycling of nutrients, right? What does it look like? That means that, are people sort of familiar with this sort of
Just
technique?
Allan Savory.
Yes, yep. He's been a very influential person in it. So, instead of having those cows spread out across a whole farm, they were in this paddock. See what it looks like? They've just walked through a water point and they're walking out to the new paddock where the grass is this long. The whole farm is somewhere between having grass that long and having grass that long, right? Getting much more water use on the next rainfall. Yep. When they walk at that density, they squash the grass. What does that make? Makes mulch. Yep, it's that simple. It's that simple. This is former chairman of Central West CMA, Tom Gavel's farm. Big, ugly salt patch. Changed a lot of things on the salt patch. I think it's where we showed them bogged pictures from before. But the major outcomes Tom's had is about how does he view his landscape now in terms of how do I manufacture diversity of water use across a mixed grazing farm in between Wellington and Molong, right?
So taken his tree cover from 0.5% to 17%. He's actually taken his paddock numbers from 20 to 87. Watering points from 7 to about, I think it's close to 30, 40, 40. So he's got better control of his grazing.
Yeah.
How much land?
With more
About
cover, with more trees.
1,200 acres.
Yeah. So one of the things that's hard at 100 kilometres an hour is you see this, okay? Those things are what you see. But what I want you to look for is, what do you reckon them different coloured greens mean? Different stages of growth, right? So across his farm, at any particular rain event, there will be different areas with different stages of growth, meaning much more chance to catch the water that's there and use it, right? If his paddocks are all this high, we know what happens. Yep. David Marsh at Boorowa. Same sort of system. I met David Marsh when he was winning the wheat prizes at the Cowra show. He's done sheep and cattle. He now, last time I spoke to him, he only had cattle. He now has about 95 paddocks on his 600 hectare farm, right? A lot of them, I'll show you the fences he uses now, right? 2-wire electrics, okay? Again, same situation. One paddock looks like this. The other 89 paddocks look somewhere between that and this, right? So when it rains, the fences from the uphill neighbours fall over and David's dams don't fill. Yep. What's he done? Okay.
About 2,500 sheep in that one mob.
Yeah. Yep. So people who exhibit this sort of technique, and there's a few of them much closer to David Marsh than you, what have they changed up here? They've changed their understanding of grassland ecology and how they can use large herbivores to promote that. They also seem to have learnt or have an inherent skill in animal behaviour management, right? Because moving this many animals in certain ways just requires a bit of a change in your head. You tend to leave the loud, noisy dogs at home, right? Yeah. So when you go to a farm like this, you see fat horses and bored dogs, right? And then they also tend to learn a fair bit about how do they match the numbers of animals they've got with how much grass they've got. And that's a very dynamic thing. If David Marsh was here, if Tom Gavel was here, they wouldn't say it, but we know they make money in droughts, right? Because every day they know exactly how much grass they've got, how many days ahead they need to sell animals, and their animals all look like that, right? Okay, that's a salt patch on David Marsh's farm, right? All he's done to make it go away is change the way he opened and closed the gate, okay? And if David and also his friend who's just up the road called Andrew Southwell, they would say because salt patches are pretty small, then the level of management you need is quite intense, but they can be quite productive because there's water there, right? And back the Wiradjuri people thought they were a very important, productive part of the landscape.
Interestingly enough, just after that, I'll mention that photo, after 7 years of the management regime, fungi rings and the whole microbiology of that soil just went from there to there.
So they're actually quite nutrient rich in a way.
Yes.
Salts.
Yeah.
Salts aren't really nutrient rich, they're mineral rich. Mineral rich. So lots of parts of the soil food web and the insect web, they need that mineral kick, right? Yeah, yep. Yep. This is just more of David Marsh's place. So yeah, what's it look like from the road? Most of his paddocks will look something like that, right? Because they've had 90 days of rest, minimum. Sometimes he also has a pattern in his head where he leaves some paddocks where they're not grazed for 200 days, right? To promote maximum grass. He's also playing around with isolated paddock trees to link up some of his bigger plantings. But I think the answer to your question is David has made the salt go away with perennial pastures. I think that point was brought up before. He's put a fair significant put of trees into some parts of his farm, but the other parts of his farm that had salt, they've just had grazing management.
And diversity is like increased when you do that with the because the cows or whatever have to eat everything that's there. They don't just pick nice stuff.
Yeah. And you also have the opportunity to be tactical, right? So I apologise to all the horse owners here, you poor things. But no, we've talked about it. You know what happens if we put a horse in a paddock, right? Dead trees wreck soil, right? And the opposite of that is just as powerful. If we choose to put the enormous power of 4,500 DSC into a paddock for a certain amount of time, it will have an outcome. Does that outcome mean that we want more kangaroo grass, more red grass, more glycines? Well, that tells us when we put the animals in, when we take them out, how much pressure we put on, right? We can do the opposite. If you give me a mob of cows and say I want that paddock to be full of saffron thistles, I can make that happen, right? But if you apply that same skill in a different way, you can fundamentally change the ecology by running with the systems that you want. Is that making sense? Good. Yeah, it's about if you want more red grass, let it seed, then graze it heavily, then put the animals where you want the red grass.
So Paul I've been working with, he will use particular days and go, okay, this is where I would really like some of these tree saplings to come up. There's some big older ones here. Takes, a little mob of sheep or cattle to that area with the dogs just before it rains, holds them, keeps them there, reads the paper, has a cup of tea, moves them on. 6 months later, he's just got a little forest of saplings. Yeah.
If you haven't read the book, The Science of Shepherding, read it. Yep, another cult. It'll tell you how there's a whole industry in the border of France and Spain where for hundreds of years the local sheepmen have made money out of poisonous plants, right? Which is about how you manage herd dynamics and when they eat what. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Cows do the job. Cows do the job. Right, what has he done? So, way back in 96, this is some work done by a CSIRO hydrologist called Russell Crosby. Very interesting fella. So he went out and did a heap of measurements, pre and post. Just happened to be a big land use change at David Marsh's farm, where he went from a cropping system to a perennial pasture system. Right? And so what he's done here is said this is how much rain he got that year. Big rainfall year that year. And of that, how much of it was evapotranspiration? How much was recharge? Recharge causes the salt, right? How much of it was runoff? Right? So out of that rain that fell, how did he split it up? Then as we see as he goes through a perennial pasture system, what happens? The recharge and the runoff just disappears, right? That's how you manage hydrology with animals, right? Because you just play with the ET bit. although these problems are big and slow, they're only out by a little bit. You know, they're only out by a little bit. If we can maximise this, we can go a long way. Yep. Yep. And it's over most of your landscape. You're not throwing this Hail Mary to say, I'm going to do this really tricky, complicated thing in the exact right spot at the right time. We're going to have the whole landscape pumping water for us with grass. Okay. What's the convergence of the cult? Dirt. Right? Sooner or later, we all end up at this point where we start thinking about what is a healthy soil. And for those of us who have a background in bulldozers and diesel and steel, it's about structure. It's about structure. A healthy soil is one that's friable at the surface and doesn't have a Komatsu. Some people get really tied up with the chemistry, right? They enter through a lens of chemistry and they talk about calcium, magnesium balances and blah, 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 right? Soil chemistry is incredibly varied and will always be so, right? Particularly if you live in Eastern Australia where the Lachlan Fold Belt meets the Permian basins. You will have a huge diversity of soil chemistry, and most tests are misleading because they don't cover the variability you're going to get in most paddocks. Okay, nodding heads. People spent lots of money, like I have, on soil tests. Isn't it funny how you take soil test in 20 different soils and the bloke comes back and says, "Oh, 2 tonnes of lime." and here's the invoice for the soil test. And soil organic life. So maybe some of our biodynamic colleagues, some of our soil bioag people, they're entering through this prism. Conservation farmers enter through that prism because they go from turning dirt over with sweeps this wide to using narrow points to soil structure. But sooner or later we all realise that in the middle's where we've got to be. That no matter where you enter, it's all about most of the landscape being covered with soil. It can be a tin roof that leaks and runs off, or it can be a sponge that grows things. And at the best tactics we've got are ones that go, how am I going to improve that? Right? It also recognises that in the Australian landscape there are limits to things because of stuff that happened 100 million years ago. There are some constraints in your landscape. Some of them are the reason that the water was at 60 centimetres and your plants couldn't get at it. There's some sort of root-free zone there, right? Some of them are pH. We could go to paddocks this afternoon and find acidity problems at one end of it and alkalinity problems at the other end of it, right? They're constraints. So it means that the tactic you apply may work faster, slower, or not at all, based on those constraints. Make sense? Okay. So, I could show, I've got, this thumb drive's full of more exciting pictures of what farmers have done, spread all across Eastern Australia. What do they converge on? They tend to be heading towards production systems which encourage diversity. Now that sounds really wanky, but for the first 10 years of my agricultural life, my job was to do that tillage to kill the plants to grow the wheat crop, right? So my job was to discourage diversity, and I was really good at it, really good at it. They tend, when you go to these farms, you see high proportions of perennial plants, even if they're growing annual things, right? And they're also, as the Richard Langley example is, that they're setting up perennial systems with annual plants. That's incredibly exciting. They don't leave the dirt bare, right? How do we... Not any setting off my alarm, is it? We don't leave the soil bare, right? We can learn a lot from some of the great genocides of history about how you kill a population. Removing habitat and food source is a pretty good way of doing it. Just ask Joe Stalin. Okay? Production systems which are resilient to climate. Okay? The wheat doesn't work. The wheat doesn't work. Didn't get a crop again this year. Yeah, okay. Righto. What's the climate telling us? What's the climate going to do in the future? Right? And they're all doing production systems which are robust. Okay? What's robust? Robust is to take advantage of good times, to be able to expand into good areas. It's no good surviving the drought if your paddocks are still this high after 100 mils of rainfall. That's not a robust system. Okay? It's the opposite of the fat, wheezy kid that we went to school with. Right? He wasn't very robust. Even when placed in a good situation, couldn't thrive. All of the farms that I've visited to that are fixed salt, that do that, tend to have really productive businesses. Right? They've also had they also tend to know what they're doing. So that ability to, in 2 minutes, say, what is the aim of the farm and how do I know if I'm heading in the right direction? Now, I know most of you don't derive agriculture as your primary thing, but that same strategic thinking, what am I trying to do here? How will I know I'm on the way? How will I know when I get there? That's actually the hardest thing. Everything else is just, follow that example or follow that one. Find the one that's most appropriate or the one that's most fun. Okay, did you have a question? Or are you stretching? Right. Okay, that's my Convergence of the Cults talk. Are we ready for lunch? That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. So, if we go back to this is the strategic thinking thing. That one, okay. So let's just think we're on any of these HGLs that Allan spoke about. What you'll find in your description of the HGL is it will have one or more functions. How confusing is that? Right? One or more functions. Some of them may even contradict each other. The universe is a bit like that. Okay? Then that gets you to think, okay, well, if I'm trying to maintain and improve that function, then some of these strategies will be appropriate or not. And that's the information we try and give you. So if you're trying to manage a landscape where base flow is important to local streams, function C, certain management strategies will be for you. And certain won't. Not that they're right or wrong, it's just appropriateness. And then once you've decided what your strategy is, then it's relatively easy to cut your landscape up and put the individual tactics in there, right? And the tactics are all just ways of using water, more diversity, healthy soils. Is that what you sort of took out of my slides? That's all they're doing. That's all they're doing. And there's a million ways to do it. Yeah.
On your website, do you have this sort of saline-friendly plants, shrubs?
Yep. And they, one of the things we noticed when we came and did the last training day here was we went to we're probably going to go to the same one. There's a lot bloody growing there anyway, right? And many people have made the mistake of saying, the ground's the salty patch is 50% bare, let's kill everything and try and grow something else. We're on much more of the idea of having a 5-year plan to cover that bare ground, right? And maybe slowly adding things is much more of a risk-sensitive way to go rather than hiring someone to come in and rip it up and try and sow something and hope for the perfect season. Because when it comes to salt patches, they change temporally and spatially. So if we go there and measure the topsoil salinity today, it will be much different to what it would have been in mid-November. Yep. So trying to pick a magic sowing date, magic sowing time, it's pretty fraught. So what you find is that what has all that learning done to the industry? If you go into any of the major rural suppliers, no matter what seed supply they deal with, there'll be a salt mix, right? And it'll be a best guesstimate of things that go sooner or later across a salt patch. If you had done that in 1990, it would have been 3 plants, right? Do it now, it's probably closer to 20. What is that? That's people recognising these sites are all a bit different and they're going to be different over time. So let's just chuck lots of things that have tolerance to waterlogging and salinity in there and they'll sort themselves out. And the other thing we see is that the sites close up, right? So that the least salt tolerant ones grow on the edge and then you can draw the rings of where the salt starts to really impact them. And over time, if you change that by turning the water off at the source, then they go in there. Yeah. Yep. And the other thing I suppose we've seen a lot of success with around here, because some of the sites are a bit small and a bit finicky, is just turning off the evaporation process by physically mulching them, right, it can have a huge impact, particularly if there's something growing in the background, because we've lost the topsoil and exposed to sodic subsoil and stuff like that. And how you do that, you might say, well, if I'm going to chuck some hay out at any time of the year, I'll put it there, let the cows spread it for me. Or I'll do what other farmers near Cowra do, is if they do feed, put it on the salt patch, tip a bit of molasses in the top, and they'll do your mulching for you, right?
I have a classic photo of a dummy-do of a woman had a baby clothes, the knitted baby clothes, and she put them on the salt site, all these different colours, and just put on these pink baby jumpers, and grass was growing out, there was bare, so anything. Now wool bags.
So while we wait for lunch, I might just quickly talk about the salt management stuff. Yep. That if so we've taken our eye off the cause that's all out in the landscape, the excess recharge that's causing the salt problem, and we've walked onto a salt patch. We're usually confronted with a couple of issues. One is that you've got some salt, right? And sometimes if we dig a hole into the ground and we take some samples at a couple of different layers, and we do this quite a bit, and if we map how much salt over how deep, right, and we graph it, we can end up with a couple of different shapes. One shape we get a lot is that, right? Really high salt, close to the surface. What do you reckon that's called by? Evaporation. Classic. So if you see that, one of your big problems is not actually the salt, because it might be a quite low level, right? It's the evaporation. How do we fix evaporation? Yeah? Cover the ground. Mulch and growing things, right? Get the plants having to live with this much salt, not that much. Right? How do you do that? You can put in some salt-tolerant plants, right? You can manage them in a way which makes mulch, or you can manage them in a way which makes bare ground. That's up to you. Right? You can add mulch. You can add systems that create more mulch. You can have sacrifice plants. So lots of people, when they're sowing some sites, they will put in things like winter cereal plants, oats, rye, corn, stuff like that. Just grows a little bit and falls over. Right. We also have issues with waterlogging. Why is waterlogging a problem to some plants? Does anyone know why? Not enough oxygen. Simple. Not enough oxygen in the root zone. So we have some plants which are very tolerant to waterlogging, right? So we'd put them there. And we have some plants that are very tolerant to salt, right? So there are plants that grow at Cobar that are incredibly tolerant to salt, but if you put them in a wet salt patch, they'll just die, right? So across our salt patch, we'll get a mixture of waterlogging and salt characteristics. So that's why we tend to say, you know what, it's going to be more than one plant. It's going to be more than 5 plants. It's probably going to be 20 plants. Yep. And if 2 of them are already growing there, that's a pretty good start. Yeah. How do we change our management to get the ones that are dancing around the edge to come into the middle? And that's usually grazing management. Yep. The other question that we had to cover before we were allowed to have lunch is the issue of total grazing pressure. Right? What are we supposed to say? Industrial and non-industrial animals. and we've just done a big job around Braidwood. Major issue for salinity management in the Mongalo and Windellama areas is kangaroos, right? They are totally changing the ability of the landscape to use water by overgrazing the mainly native pastures which are there, keeping them this high. So when we talk about managing the soil with plants, with animals, then total grazing pressure management has to be part of the discussion. And I think some of the comments I had before we started were that's a big issue for you. Yep, that getting those hopper things to respect what you're trying to do in a grassland ecology is a bit hard. Yep. There's some tools to minimise it. Turning off your water is a good way to do it, right? Reducing access to water points. So again, if you go to if farmers who have systems where they move their animals around, they tend to move their water around too, right? And one thing that has been noticed with people who do that sort of big mob rotational grazing is that you don't often see a mob of kangaroos hang with a big mob of sheep for long. They keep moving as well, which is probably what we want. We've also seen some pretty innovative stuff where some farmers who found scalds that were sort of 1/4 hectare to maybe 1/2 hectare, they made them inhospitable places for kangaroos by spreading brush on them. Right? The kangaroos don't like not being able to make a quick getaway. They're a flight animal. So if you put lots of tangled sticks on the ground, they don't like being there. It messes them up. Okay? Yep. So when we go out, if we go out this afternoon and we sit on a salt patch, we'll be talking about what's the salt characteristic, what's the waterlogging characteristic, how do we get things growing. The salt patch is because we have too much water. What a problem to have. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? Or just ask me questions over the break if you like. Yep.